Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to kind of take a journey
Okay.
into the world of Bob Camblin, a fascinating artist who,
Mm.
as we'll discover, was both prolific and deliberately elusive.
Yes.
We've got a treasure trove of sources, biographical info,
Mm-hmm.
art reviews, even some of his personal writings.
Okay.
And our mission is to uncover the man behind the art and the meaning behind the brushstrokes.
What makes Camblin so interesting is this paradox. He was widely respected in the art world, but he almost seemed to be allergic to fame.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin with someone like that? I guess the beginning is as good a place as any. What do we know about his early life?
Well, he was born in Oklahoma in 1928, and it seems like his path was almost preordained.
Hmm.
Both his parents were artists, so he was surrounded by creativity from the very start.
So nature and nurture both playing a role.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating how the visual landscape of his hometown, Ponca City, seems to have seeped into his art.
You're talking about the contrast between the opulence of the Marland estate and the starkness of the Oklahoma landscape,
So
right?
exactly. On one hand, you have this almost fairy tale-like mansion,
Yeah.
a symbol of wealth and extravagance, and on the other, you have this vast open space and this iconic pioneer woman statue,
Right.
which, by the way, he directly references in some of his later work.
Wow.
It's like those early visual influences, the lavish and the stark, became woven into his artistic DNA.
That's such a great point. It's
Yeah.
like those contrasting images became a visual metaphor for the tensions he explored throughout his career.
Hmm.
So how did his artistic journey unfold from there?
Well, after honing his skills at the Kansas City Art Institute, he wins a Fulbright scholarship to Italy. Can you imagine being exposed to the masters in Florence and Rome at that age?
Yeah.
Seeing those masterpieces firsthand?
It must have been mind-blowing. But even with that early success, it seems like he always grappled with the commercial aspects of art.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's that story about the patron who paid him in a glass tube. Yes.
Because Camblin didn't want to touch the money directly.
That anecdote perfectly illustrates the conflict he felt between the need to make a living and his desire for artistic purity. He talks about this struggle a lot in his writings, too.
It's like he wanted the art to speak for itself, not the price tag.
Mm-hmm.
And that tension between artistic integrity and commercial success, that's something that so many artists struggle with, isn't it?
Absolutely. But for Camblin, it seemed to be a particularly defining struggle.
So he goes on to teach at some pretty prestigious art schools, Ringling, the University of Illinois, even Rice University for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But then he just walks away from it all. Why would someone give up a secure academic career to become a nomad?
It's like he was rejecting the conventional path, choosing the freedom of a nomadic life over the stability of academia. He traveled all over Italy, France, Mexico, even the South Pacific, selling his art and taking commissions to fund his adventures.
Talk about living the dream.
Yeah.
But let's get into his art. We've touched on his early influences.
Right. But how would you describe his overall style? I know he started with abstract expressionism, but then things took some interesting turns, right?
Well, one way to think about Camblin's artistic journey is as a movement from the literal to the symbolic. His early work often had a social protest element, engaging directly with issues of his time.
But that shifted toward a more abstract, symbolic style.
Exactly. And this is where the influence of those European masters he encountered in Italy becomes really apparent.
Mm.
There's a depth, a layering of meaning that starts to emerge in his work.
And then there's the recurring motif of metamorphosis.
Yes.
Those images of scarecrows, puppets, shells that pop up throughout his work.
Right.
What do you make of that fascination with transformation?
It's not just visual, it's thematic. Camblin seemed to be grappling with the very nature of change and evolution,
Okay.
both on a personal level and on a larger societal scale.
Mm.
Think about what those symbols represent. Scarecrows, standing guard against the unknown, puppets manipulated by unseen forces, shells, the remnants of life that has moved on. It's like he's exploring these liminal spaces, these moments of transition and becoming.
It's almost as if those images are visual metaphors for the constant state of flux that we all experience, both individually and collectively. It's making me think about how change can be unsettling, but also a necessary part of growth.
Exactly. And then there's Muchas Volantes, a style he co-developed with artist Nancy Giordano. It's a bit difficult to describe it. Imagine incredibly intricate patterns of dots and dashes,
Okay.
almost like a secret code that create these mesmerizing optical illusions.
Ooh, Musha Volantes, what does that even mean?
It's French for flying flies, and it refers to those tiny specks you sometimes see floating in your field of vision.
Oh, right. I always wondered what those were called. So
Yeah.
he's using art to mimic a visual phenomenon.
In a way, yes, but it goes deeper than that. It's like he's using Musha Volantes to challenge our very perception of reality. He wants us to question what we see, to acknowledge that our perception is always filtered through our own unique lens.
That's pretty mind-blowing. It seems like everything with Camblin has multiple layers of meaning.
It does.
Is there a way to tie all of these threads together? What are some of the overarching themes or motifs that run through his work?
Well, we've already touched on metamorphosis and
Ah.
this idea of illusion versus perception, but I think another key theme is the tension between simplicity and depth.
Okay.
His line work is often incredibly elegant, almost minimalist, but then you realize there are these layers of hidden imagery and symbolism that add so much complexity.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying that things are rarely what they seem on the surface.
Okay. I'm getting the feeling that with Camlin, it's all about looking beyond the surface.
Yes.
But how do we do that? What are some specific examples from his work that can help us unlock those deeper layers of meaning?
One painting that really stands out is Private Property. Imagine this stark desert landscape, almost monochromatic, with these bare trees linked together by a rope.
Hmm.
It's incredibly simple, yet deeply unsettling.
What makes it unsettling?
It's the way those trees are anchored down, almost like they've been forcibly placed there. It raises all sorts of questions about ownership, boundaries, and our impact on the natural world.
And it's done in those muted, almost watercolor-like layers, right?
Exactly. Which adds to that feeling of unease, like something's not quite right. There's a real tension between the vastness of the natural world and our human need to impose our will on it.
That's a really powerful image. It's making me think about how we often try to control things that are ultimately beyond our control.
And that tension between control and surrender is something that Camblin seems to be exploring throughout his work.
I'm ready for another example.
Okay.
What else can you share that will help us unlock those deeper layers of meaning?
Okay, here's a detail I find fascinating. In some of his earlier works, Camblin would make corrections by pasting white gouache and paper over sections he wanted to change. You can actually see these layers in a piece called The Descent from the Cross.
It's like he's showing us his process, his evolution as an artist.
Exactly, and it speaks to this idea that art is not about achieving some perfect finished product. It's about the journey, the
Mhm.
constant state of flux, the
Yeah.
willingness to revisit and revise.
Right.
It's a very different way of thinking about art, and it ties back to that Zen influence we were talking about earlier.
This is why I love these deep dives. We're not just learning about an artist, we're learning about different ways of seeing the world.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Camlin's art, but what about the man himself? What kind of person was he?
Well, the sources describe him as enigmatic, iconoclastic, even a mystical trickster.
Those are some pretty intriguing labels.
They are.
What do they tell us about who he was?
He was clearly a complex individual. On one hand, he was this incredibly talented artist, drawing inspiration from literature, philosophy, even those early visual experiences in his hometown.
Right.
He was constantly reading, absorbing everything like a sponge.
The lifelong learner, it sounds like.
Absolutely. But he also had this mischievous side,
Okay.
this desire to poke fun at the art world and its conventions.
And that brings us back to the Mr. Peanut thing, right?
Yes, the fact that he owned a Mr. Peanut costume and would sometimes show up to events wearing it,
Yeah.
it says so much about his personality.
Okay, I have to admit that's pretty hilarious.
It is.
But it also makes me wonder, was it just a bit of fun? Or was there a deeper meaning behind it?
I think it speaks to his desire for anonymity,
Okay.
his reluctance to let his ego get in the way of the art. Remember, he often signed his work as anonymous or anonymous artists.
Right.
It's like he was trying to remove himself from the equation, to let the art exist on its own terms.
Which, again, plays into that tension between artist and commerce. If you're anonymous, you're not building a personal brand. You're not seeking fame or fortune. You're just creating for the sake of creating.
Exactly, and that's a pretty radical idea, especially in today's art world, where it's all about self-promotion and building a following.
Right.
Camblin was going against the grain, challenging the very notion of what it means to be an artist in the modern world.
We've covered so much ground already, and I feel like we've only just begun to scratch the surface. This is one deep dive I definitely want to keep exploring.
Me too.
You know, as we delve deeper into Camlin, I'm struck by how much he was influenced by literature.
Yeah.
We see those references to authors like Gunter Grass and Nikos Kazantzakis, and his own writing. The quotes we have, they're so poetic and thought-provoking. It's not just the visual language of his art that's fascinating, it's the verbal language, too.
Absolutely, he was a voracious reader,
Yeah.
and that love of language is woven into the very fabric of his work.
Yeah.
It's not just about referencing other authors, it's about integrating words into the art itself.
Can you give us an example of how he does that?
Think about those scarecrow drawings we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
You'll have this incredibly detailed image of a scarecrow rendered in his signature style.
Right.
And then right there on the canvas are blocks of text describing the scarecrow as a sculpture.
So he's blurring the lines between what we see and what we read.
Exactly. It's like he's playing with our expectations,
Yeah.
challenging us to consider how words and images interact to create meaning.
Is he suggesting that words can enhance or even change how we see an image?
I think he's exploring that very idea. In one of his writings, he says, painters and sculptors often reject words as dangerous to the perception of their art, and yet communication continues to grow, as well as the sophistry in explaining art.
Hmm.
It's like he's acknowledging the limitations of language, but also recognizing its power to shape how we see and interpret the world.
So it's this push and pull between wanting the art to speak for itself,
Right.
but also recognizing that words can add another layer of meaning, another way to engage the viewer.
Precisely. And it's a really interesting tension, especially when you consider the context of the art world in the 20th century. I mean, think about Tom Wolfe's The Painted Word and the idea that modern art had become so dominated by language,
Yeah.
by the interpretations of critics and historians.
Right, like the words were becoming more important than the art itself.
Exactly. And I think Camblin is pushing back against that.
No.
He's saying, look, the art should speak for itself. Don't let the words get in the way.
Yeah.
But then he turns around and uses words in a way that's completely his own.
Right.
It's like he's creating his own visual language, one that's rooted in both image and text.
It's like he's saying words can be a trap, but they can also be a tool.
Exactly. It's all about how you use them. And Camblin was a master at using words to enhance and complicate our understanding of his visual art.
Okay, let's circle back to the Mr. Peanut persona for a moment.
Sure.
We touched on it earlier, but I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on why he embraced that anonymity, that playful concealment of his identity.
I think it speaks to several things. On one level, it's definitely about subverting expectations, poking fun at the art world's obsession with celebrity.
Right.
Remember, he often signed his work as anonymous, or anonymous artists as well.
So it was a deliberate attempt to downplay his own role, to let the art exist on its own terms.
Absolutely. It's like he's saying, don't focus on me, focus on the art. But I think it goes deeper than that.
Okay.
It also connects to his fascination with masks and the idea of transformation.
Okay.
Remember those recurring motifs we talked about? Scarecrows, puppets, shells?
Yeah.
They all represent different aspects of concealment, of shedding one identity to reveal another.
So Mr. Peanut becomes another layer of that exploration of metamorphosis.
Yeah.
He's playing with identity, transforming himself into this playful, anonymous figure. It's almost like a performance art piece in itself.
I think you're right on the mark. It's a performance,
Yeah.
a commentary on the nature of identity and the role of the artist in society, and it's also incredibly clever marketing when you think about it.
Right.
I mean, who can forget an artist who shows up to an exhibition in a Mr. Peanut costume?
It definitely makes you remember him. So he's challenging conventions, but also, perhaps unintentionally, creating his own brand of quirky notoriety.
Exactly. And it speaks to the complexity of Camblin as an individual. He was full of contradictions, which is part of what makes him so fascinating.
Let's dive back into his artistic process for a bit.
Okay.
We talked about those corrections he made to his early work, those layers of gouache and paper that reveal his process of revision.
Right.
It's a very different way of thinking about art than the traditional notion of a finished masterpiece, isn't it?
It really is. He wasn't precious about his work in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
He was willing to experiment, to revisit, to even obscure parts of his creations. It's almost as if he saw art as an ongoing conversation,
Right.
a dialogue between the artist and the canvas, rather than a monologue that ends with a signature.
And that ties back to the idea of embracing imperfection,
Yeah.
which is so central to Zen philosophy.
Precisely. It's about letting go of the need for control, allowing the process to unfold organically, and accepting the beauty of imperfection.
And speaking of process, wasn't there an anecdote about how he envisioned a different kind of art exhibition? One that moved away from the traditional gallery experience?
He talked about wanting to break down the barriers between the artist and the viewer, to allow people to witness the hallways of the process, rather than just the finished
He
objects.
wanted to pull back the curtain and let people see the messy, chaotic beauty of creation.
Exactly. He wasn't interested in presenting a polished facade. He wanted to reveal the struggle, the constant state of becoming that is the creative process.
It's so refreshing to hear that.
It is.
Because so often in the art world, we only see the end result.
Right.
We don't get a glimpse of the blood, sweat, and tears, the countless revisions, the moments of doubt and inspiration that went into creating it.
I think Camblin understood that the journey is just as important as the destination, and he wanted to share that journey with his audience.
Okay, before we move on, I have to ask you to break down Mouche's Volantes for me one more time.
Sure.
It's such an intriguing concept,
Yeah.
but I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Okay, let's try this. Imagine looking at a Camblin painting that uses this style. At first glance, you might see abstract patterns of dots and dashes.
Right.
But as you gaze at it longer, your perception begins to shift. Those dots and dashes start to coalesce. They begin to dance and interact. And suddenly, you start to perceive three-dimensional forms. Images emerging from the seemingly chaotic patterns. It's an optical illusion.
Wow.
But it's also a metaphor for how our perception of reality is constantly being shaped and reshaped by our experiences, our beliefs, and even our own biology.
So it's like he's using those dots and dashes to represent the building blocks of perception itself.
Yeah.
Like those tiny specks we see floating in our vision are actually metaphors for the way we construct reality.
That's a great way to put it. He's taking this everyday phenomenon, this quirk of our visual system, and turning it into a powerful artistic statement about the nature of perception.
It's amazing to think about all the different influences that went into Camblin's work. From those early visual experiences in his hometown to the European masters to literature, philosophy, and even Zen Buddhism, it's like he was constantly synthesizing, weaving together these disparate threads into something wholly unique.
And that's precisely what makes him so fascinating. He defies categorization.
Right.
He was an artist, a thinker, a provocateur, a mystic, a comedian. He was all of these things and none of them simultaneously.
And that's just the kind of artist I love to learn about.
Me too.
The ones who make you question everything you thought you knew about art.
Camblin definitely fits that bill.
Well, this has been an incredible journey so far, and I can't wait to explore even more of his work. We've explored Camblin's life, his artistic evolution, his love of language, his playful personality, but
Right.
what's the bigger picture here? What's the lasting impact of his work? Why should we, the listeners, care about this artist we may have never even heard of before?
That's the key question, isn't it? And it's one that I think continues to resonate with artists and art lovers today.
Yeah.
Camblin's work wasn't about providing easy answers or neat interpretations. It was about provoking thought, challenging perceptions, making us see the world in new ways.
It's like he was planting seeds of ideas and then letting us, the viewers, cultivate our own understanding.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to his deep respect for the viewer's intelligence and ability to engage with art on a personal level.
Yeah.
There's this quote from one of the sources that really captures this idea.
Okay.
What is art but a series of questions disguised as images? That really gets to the heart of Camblin's approach, I think.
It's not about dictating meaning, it's about inviting interpretation. And that ties back to his embrace of ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
Those layers of symbolism, the hidden meanings. He's not giving us all the answers, he's encouraging us to search for them ourselves.
Exactly. His work is full of those hidden pathways, those invitations to look closer, to think deeper. But it's not about deciphering some secret code. It's about engaging in that process of discovery, of allowing the art to speak to you on a personal level.
It almost makes you feel like you're part of the creative process, like you're collaborating with the artist to unlock the meaning of the work.
I think that's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
And he even talks about this directly in one of his quotes.
Okay.
The real seeing has its own property of deception. It becomes a whirlpool of relationships going in all directions from the point of entering.
Wow.
It's like he's anticipating those multiple interpretations, those subjective readings, and embracing them as part of the creative process.
So he's relinquishing control, inviting us to participate in the meaning-making.
Yeah.
And that's what makes his work so relevant today, I think.
I agree.
In a world that's increasingly obsessed with certainty and easy answers, Camblin reminds us of the power of ambiguity, of the beauty that can be found in the unknown.
He's not trying to tell us what to think. He's showing us how to think.
Yeah.
He's encouraging us to embrace the mystery, to question our assumptions, to find our own truth within the layers of his art.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, don't just look, see, don't just hear, listen, don't just consume, engage.
And in today's world where we're bombarded with information and images, that call to really see, to really engage feels more important than ever.
It really does.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Bob Camblin, I'm curious,
Yeah.
what stands out to you the most about this artist? What will you take away from this exploration?
For me, it's that deliberate choice to remain an enigma, to resist easy categorization. He was a master of his craft, but he never let his ego get in the way of the art itself.
Right.
He was more interested in the process and the journey than in arriving at some fixed destination, and I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us, not just artists, but anyone who's striving to create something meaningful.
I love that. And for me, it's the playfulness, the humor that runs through so much of his work. Even when he's tackling serious themes, there's this sense of delight, of mischief, even in it. It's like he's inviting us to not take ourselves too seriously, to
Right.
find joy in the absurdity of it all.
That's a great point. He was clearly serious about his art, but he never lost that sense of wonder, that childlike curiosity.
Right.
And that's something we can all learn from.
So here's a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about how Camblin's work challenges our perception of reality.
Right.
But what if we take that a step further? What if his deliberate use of ambiguity, of hidden imagery, is actually a commentary on the nature of truth itself? What if he's suggesting that truth is not something fixed and absolute, but rather something fluid, something that's constantly evolving and shifting depending on our perspective? That's something to ponder as you continue your own deep dive into the world of Bob Camblin.
And don't forget to seek out his work firsthand if you have the chance. There's nothing quite like experiencing it in person, getting lost in those intricate details, those layers of meaning, those surprising moments of beauty and wonder.
That's it for this deep dive into the world of Bob Camblin. We hope you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating artist with us. Until next time, keep diving.